All right. Hi, everyone. If we're all ready, I guess I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. I'm Stephanie Trusty. My first time doing this, so I'm very excited. I'm a solutions developer here at Decisions. Um, so we host the Lunch and Learns Monday through Thursday at noon Eastern time. And it's just an informal session where you can ask any questions and I'll do my best to answer it if I can. Um, so yeah, if any of you have questions, feel free to either drop them in the chat or the Q&A. You can also unmute or raise your hand, whatever you feel comfortable doing. So yeah. Oh, I see Chris raised his hand. Chris, I'm going to ask you to unmute if you want to ask your question.
Sure, if I can. Seem to be fighting with Zoom today.
I understand. I've been fighting with Zoom today as well.
All right, I have a couple of fiddly questions that would be, what a way to start your lunch and learn situations, huh?
It'll be exciting for both of us, right?
Maybe I should post this one in the chat. Let me get to a chat window just to offer a, because it's kind of a if this then that kind of a situation. And
Okay.
all right, so I'll read it. Flow 1 calls flow 2, right? And passes in a flow structure. So flow 2 changes something in that flow structure. And what I find is that flow 1 is able to see the change. And to my programmer mind, that is completely sensible, even welcome. But now I find myself wondering, is that something that is a feature, or is that something that is just an accident of implementation and could change someday?
So I'm actually not sure about that, Chris. Matt, do you have any insight about this?
I will say I've definitely noticed this behavior. I've been working at Decisions for a little over 5 years, and I think I've seen it behave that way for that whole time. Now, you're wondering, could that change? I wouldn't expect it to, but I also wouldn't rely on the flows behaving that way. And I think your best bet is to pass out that flow structure out of flow 1 just to be certain that you're always going to get that updated value in flow 2.
Well, and can you understand my temptation to do this?
Yes, I can.
So, yeah, I was afraid you were going to say that. All right. Have to reconsider some of that. And if I could get you to also entertain a second, what I'll call style question. And this has to do with a drop-down list that has a dynamic list as, list input, as it were. Or rather, it's drop-down list that the choices can change dynamically depending on what the user is doing on the form. Mostly about when they're typing something into the list. The original way we did this was called by way of a private flow, if you're familiar with that term. So the drop-down list can have a source for its list to be a flow, and then you give it the flow, and that has been called a private flow. More recently in release 6, it is possible to use a data flow instead. And I was wondering about your thoughts about the trade-off of the private flow versus a data flow. I get with the advantage of the data flow is that you can debug it, but I don't know if there's any reason you might prefer a private flow.
I've personally never used private flows, so I don't know how they work or the differences between them. So I'm again gonna pass this one to Matt.
This is another tricky one, Chris. You're coming in with great questions. I know of only one advantage that the private flow offers. And in every other case, I would suggest using a data flow, or in a newer version, an active form flow for the same behavior. But with a private flow that sources the dropdown, the one thing that I've seen you can do there that you can't do otherwise is get the value of typed in text into that dropdown.
And that's actually what we, that we do that routinely. Actually, is that we get the, use the typed text into that flow so that we can then refine the list.
So yeah, in that case, private flow is the way to go.
Yeah. So you say. Now, the reason why, though, the question is that somewhere in the last 5 releases, for release 6, for decision 6, you can now use a data flow to do it.
To take in that type text like into the dropdown?
Yes.
Oh. Well, then I'm incorrect here, and I would suggest using a data flow.
All right. And that data flow then, it also strikes me as, since it's responding to the user typing along, my hunch is that we should keep the option for is blocking unchecked. Would you agree with that, in the abstract sense?
The leave is blocking unchecked. Can you repeat why you want to leave that unchecked?
So the thinking is, if my data flow, which is going to go marshal a list that, if I'm typing stamp, for example, and so I type S, I type a T, I type an A. With each letter press, the data flow could be going off and trying to get me a list, like maybe a top 10 of matches, as it were. On the other hand, if I'm typing quickly enough, now I've got, the question becomes, well, that could necessarily cause 3 different flow runs, right? One for the S, one for the T, one for the A, keep on going, one for the M, one for the P. If these are blocking, wouldn't they interfere with each other?
Yeah,
or the
and
typing?
what you might see is just the first letter result come back. So you could either leave that is blocking is off, so that way every time a new letter is typed, it immediately reruns that flow to get the new results. Does that flow that's running there, does it perform quickly, or is it something that like takes some time to return some results?
It is actually going to do a service call. And we are starting to, the service that it calls is typically pretty quick to respond. As in, we are accustomed to getting a response within 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds. But lately, what we find on one of these examples, for some odd reason, apparently it's not working. That's where I find myself scratching my head about, well, I see a couple of things here now that we are in this situation. One is we're using a data flow as someone had recommended to us long ago. And that the data flow, I think by default, was left with the is blocking checked. I think that's what the designer did. But what I don't understand then are these fine details about, well, okay, in the context of a drop-down list, what's the right way to work that, right? It seems like there ought to be an, it's almost like if I'm using this in the way that I'm describing, then if I have the configuration wrong, I could be interfering with myself. I fear that I am. On the other hand, I think for a casual developer, like the guy who originally did this, these are not obvious decisions, and maybe the decisions magic is stronger than I know. So that's why I come and say, well, what advice do you offer?
I would say if you're not having performance issues getting that the results back, then you could just leave is blocking off. Now, you mentioned that there's sometimes it doesn't return a result or is not as performant. Another option you may have here is instead of using like the value changed trigger to run your flow, you could use the stopped typing trigger. That way it won't run the flow until the user hasn't typed anything for some short period of time. That'll really cut back on how often it's running that flow, which should help with performance in that case.
All right.
I think the real like advice here, and this would be, you know, getting it tuned just right, is to try the other options because each case is unique. Everyone using these form flows has a different use case. And so sometimes when you're really trying to tune it just right, you want to try the different options and see which one actually does perform best in the real world.
So some of the things that I heard you say is that the private flow, as I describe it, for the drop-down list is still a part of decisions in release 8. Is that true?
Let me check. I actually don't know that off the top of my head, but I do have.
It's got to be there in release 7,
8.
Right?
I can check 8 real quick, and then obviously if it's in 8, it'll definitely be in 7.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so when I drop a drop down onto a form in version 8, the list input source can come from a flow. So
that's going to be the private flow then.
Yes, it must be.
I'm looking at the documentation and it does look like the private flow is the configuration option in 8 for your forms.
But I also think that if you check the events on the form, you're going to find the sorts of events that will let you do it by way of a data flow. And so you would use a data name for your list. And I think the usual way I do that is I actually stand up the data flow, that's sort of the lookup piece, and then I let the output just be a data name. And then I go back to the drop-down list and connect the list to that data name.
Yeah, I still think that's the best bet, even though private flows still exist all the way up into version 8. I would say the best way to go forward would be use, like you were saying, the data flow, or in version 7 and 8, active form flows.
So the active form flow would probably respond to, as you suggest, like a stop typing event, and then quickly update the list.
That's right. Yeah. Now I don't know for certain if there's a stop typing event for a dropdown specifically. I know for sure that a text box has that. Dropdown, I don't know for sure if it does.
Well, look at that in number 8, if you would. I'd be curious to know, because I can't
can
see
share
8.
my other
Checking
screen
that
and we
now.
can try it together if you like.
That would be perfect.
Okay, excellent. Let me bring that back up then. Okay. All right, can you guys see my decision studio?
Sure.
Awesome. So let's just make a quick test form. And we want to try it with the drop down. I'll just do string.
So I think the interesting part would be what events, if you want to trigger, what kind of a flow is that you keep calling it in here in number 8,
The active form flows?
active form flow?
Yeah, so we add them here. It's on the properties panel for the form. So I'll just call this like drop down test. And then when you hit edit rule flow, it'll open the editor. So I'm
Maybe
not
just
sure,
hand
for
out a
example.
constant string list, you know what I'm saying?
Sure, we can do that.
Although
It's right
I'm
there.
thinking the way you have to do it in 6, where you actually have to pass it out and then that becomes a data name and yada, 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 right? As opposed to what you can do in these where you can perhaps change the data name directly, right? Or change the controls list rather directly. I think that's what you had in mind there, Matt. Am I right?
Yeah, I thought the question was, do we have that stop typing trigger on a drop-down box for
Right.
like an active form flow?
Yeah, and that's really the question. So if the what events are now available to this? There's stop typing.
Bingo.
Awesome. So yeah, it looks like we would be able to do that. Chris, does that convince you to start using 8 now?
I was hoping we could go to 7, like in the next week or two. But then I found out that the upgrade from 6 to 7 is rather involved, which would that probably mean I would have to skip a release date just devoted to the upgrade. And I don't know that the business will tolerate that before late November. So entertaining that jump from 6 to 8 in at the start of November.
Nice. Do you have any other questions or anyone else that I can maybe try and help with, or anything you would like to see in 8? I do have 8 in my local environment, so. Okay, if no one has any other questions, I'm gonna pass it over to Matt, who's been working on some cool things in his own environment. He can show us that.
Sounds good. Thank you, Steph. So I'm going to take the next 10 minutes here to just talk about what I've been working on. It's my Lunch and Learn project. Please, if you do have any questions, feel free to interrupt me because your questions are more important than what I'm about to show. But every time I am hosting one of these Lunch and Learns and we don't have questions, I like to talk about this calculator I'm trying to build. So let me share my screen. When I first started at Decisions, I was tasked to build a calculator, and it was a very easy task because I just simply put a text box on a form and used the evaluate expression step to perform the actual math and show the result. But I wanted to take that a step further and actually recreate my childhood favorite calculator, the TI 108 here. And I wanted to create that in Decisions as a form. So I've been doing it very slowly, only working on it during Lunch and Learns. And the last time I worked on it was about a month ago. So I came back into the project today and noticed that I couldn't remember exactly what I had done. So I wanted to take this 10 minutes here to talk a little bit about technical debt and ways that we can help reduce that in Decisions. So technical debt is when you are building something and you make a decision to, usually it's a workaround or some shortcut to get the functionality that you need, but may not be as maintainable in the future. There's plenty of valid reasons to do that, but it does increase the cost of maintenance or the time it takes to actually perform a fix. You may have more bugs come up. And so it's sometimes better to avoid technical debt so that way you can reduce your maintenance in the future. And I was going to use this calculator as a example, just as a quick demonstration of what it's currently capable of doing is not very impressive so far. But if I run this calculator form flow, it'll pull up my calculator that only has a 1 and a 2 button for numbers so far. And I can perform some simple addition. I wanted it to behave as closely as possible to the actual TI 108. So I click this 1 button and the 1 populates here in my screen. And then I can click the plus, which clears that screen and allows me to enter in another button or another number. So I'm going to click 2 and hit equals, and I get 3. So pretty basic so far, and I've got a long way to go to get the rest of the functionality there, but I've got this addition happy path complete. Now, when I went to look at actually how this was built to remind myself what I was doing with the calculator and where I needed to go next, I have a couple of flows here that one of them is just called do math. And it just has 1 step in it. This, to me, there's no description. There's nothing in here that really tells me what it's doing. So I think this kind of represents some technical debt. I came in here after a month and tried to work on it, and I can't because there's some flows that I don't even know what they do. So I'm going to take this time to talk about how I can clear that up. First, I'm just going to look at this flow and see, all right, where is it being used? And the best tool for that is this dependency browser. So if I click dependencies here at the top of the flow designer, I can see what flows are actually using this. So there's a flow called operation buttons that depends on this do math flow. All right, I'm going to click on that and see where that goes. All right, so I'm looking at operation buttons. There's nothing that depends on it. So to me, that makes me wonder, is this actually still being used? I'm going to edit the flow and just double check what it's doing. Kind of hard to tell because I didn't name these steps very well, and I actually set screen value to empty. There's no description, but the dependency browser is telling me that this isn't used. So I think it's safe to go ahead and delete it. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and delete it. If I need, I can always undelete it. I'm going to start with the do math flow. Actually, I'm going to have to start with the operation button flow because otherwise it won't let me delete it with the do math. Okay, and I'm going to delete do math as well. Now I know I can undelete them if anything goes wrong, but let me just run that calculator again and make sure I didn't break anything. Okay, still behaving as I would have expected and as it was before. So I've cleaned up some of my technical debt. There's no longer flows that are unused in this folder. I have a flow here, run calculator form. I'm familiar with this. It just has the form in it and I'm using that to debug. That one's pretty straightforward. Test cache steps. That sounds like I was testing something. In fact, I know I was testing something. If I edit this, I would put something into the cache and then I got it out just to see how that would work. I can get rid of this. I don't need it anymore. I've actually implemented those cache steps in my actual calculator flows already. So that test flow I can get rid of. I'm cleaning up this folder. Now I only have 2 flows, a form and a picture of the calculator. That was just so I could remember exactly what it looks like. Update calculator screen. I'm going to browse dependencies on this again just to see where is this being used. Okay, it's being used by the 2-button rule flow and something just called rule flow. Let me go ahead and open up rule flow. That's the calculator depends on that rule flow, so I know that's in use. But rule flow isn't a great name. I bet this is the 1 button since there's only 2 buttons. And yeah, because this is a 1 going in, I know this is the 1 button. So let me rename this to 1 button rule flow. And that way now, if I look at this again, I can know immediately what it's doing. It is in use. Now, the next thing I would suggest doing to all of your flows is having a description. So that way, if anyone else comes into a flow that has been built, they at least have a fighting chance of understanding what the purpose of that flow was when it was built. So I'm going to add a description to this. This one can be really simple since there's not a whole lot going on here. It's simply triggered by that one button. So I think it's safe to say that the description can just be this flow runs when a user clicks the one button on the calculator. Since this one's not actually performing logic, it's just updating the value on that control. That description, I think, will suffice. Now, the subflow here, update calculator screen, that one would require a little bit more of an extensive description since it's actually performing a bit of work. So let me open that one up. Wow, okay, it's not actually performing that much work. Where is the work being done? Let me check the dependencies. Okay, I'm on the dependencies of the calculator form. I've got the plus button, 2, 1 equals. Okay, so the actual number buttons, those are simple. It's just displaying the number that was clicked. The work is probably being done on equals because that's where the calculator actually has to do the math. And I am right. So I can see here it's pulling the values from the cache, merging an expression, evaluating that expression, and then setting the control value of the screen. So actually, I'm kind of happy with the names of these steps. And except for set control value, I would name this set calculator screen value. So that way it's a little bit more clear.
Matt, Chris asked if both values are from cache.
Okay, so this is pulling two separate things from the cache, if I remember how I built this. First, we're pulling this would be the previous value entered by the user. So when I clicked 1 and then plus, you'll notice the 1 disappeared. It cached the 1. And then if I hit 1 or 2 or any other number, that's the current screen. So let's look at how this merge expression is looking. It's pulling previous value, the operator, and then the current screen. So the first value I'm pulling from cache is what was entered previously by the user. And then the next thing I'm pulling from the cache is actually the operator. So if I hit the plus button, all the plus button does is it caches the fact that was the most recent operator button that I clicked. So from there, I can merge that expression just like this, the value, operator, and then the current value that's sitting on the screen at that moment, and evaluate that dynamic expression that was created here.
So you're using for the cache though, you have a constant of default cache or something like that. Default.memory cache, right?
That's right.
And I don't know exactly, I'd be curious as to where you got default.memory cache from.
You know, honestly, it was in my test flow. I don't think that this has to actually be default.memory cache. This is just creating an instance, but what matters here is the key.
Okay.
So that's why both of these would be from default.memory cache.
Now, in that, so if the name is sort of very, very arbitrary, because the follow-up question is, what's the scope of this cache? I mean, this cache has to exist somewhere, right? And what's its lifetime? In other words, does it survive the flow that's running this, or I mean, this is part of the decisions magic where it's kind of like you need to know how far it goes to know how far you can run with that cache. See what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. These are configured elsewhere. So you can actually configure these cache steps to work how you want them. Like if it's a memory cache, I think you can set the time span that it lives in memory for. It's not just within the scope of one flow. I would go to the documentation because that helps spell out exactly how you set that up. And I don't know it off the top of my head. So our cache definitions page here should explain how they work. There's different kinds. Some of them persist for a period of time. You can store different types of values in the cache. And they can be configured through the system settings in administration here.
Yeah, I guess the reason why it prompted some of that question is that I have looked at, I think, at this page before, and it's a lot to digest in terms of what does it mean. And then it looked to me like you're kind of using it rather casually, and I had to ask, well, how much rope do we actually have there in terms of safety versus keeping us from doing something silly versus what it can actually do for you.
I consider the cache steps to be relatively advanced. Like, they're not commonly used.
Mm-hmm.
I'm absolutely using it very casually in this example. You're totally right about that. My goal was just to make the calculator function and store that value in like in a way that wasn't like a hidden text box on the calculator. After I tested it and it worked, I was able to put a value in and get it out. I was pretty happy with that. For if I were actually using these cache steps for like a production use case, not just a fun calculator, I would have dived further in to that documentation and to make sure I'm understanding exactly like how long it would live there and what the other parameters are. One thing you probably could do is, if you have a specific question and you are using the cache steps, I would suggest you could reach out to the support team and they can help evaluate if you're using them properly or if you're going to run into any issues.
Well, I think you actually said exactly why, that gets interesting is that, the cache steps appear superficially from your rather casual use to be far more convenient than hiding a field on the form as a container to hold something I just want to stash out of sight, right?
Oh yeah, definitely far more convenient. And in this case, like that, it only needs to live for the course of that form being up, which, in this case, like, it's not going to be long.
Which then brings up the question of, well, does the cache survive for the entire length that the form is up, or does the cache have its own independent lifetime, as it were, and data therein, which may not match up with the lifetime of the form? See what I mean?
It'll live beyond the life of that form, the way that this cache is currently set up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It may even persist until a restart, the way it's set up right now, but I don't know for sure.
Well, then that would also mean that if you had a second user on the same system, they might share each other's calculator behaviors. Am I wrong?
You know what? I think that they almost certainly would. Like, if I ran that calculator twice, I bet they would talk to each other. Let's see. All right, 1 plus, and then maybe if I hit 2 on this other calculator, yeah. So they are the same. They're pulling from the same cache. I could probably really easily fix that by like appending some GUID, generating an ID for each instance of the calculator. It's another great example of technical debt that exists within this calculator here. Is those cache steps would need to be, if I intended for these to be used by multiple users at a time on a single server, I would have to go back in and fix the way that those cache steps work.
Well, would you stick with using cache steps, or would you instead go to the sort of, it feels silly to hide a field on the form just to carry a piece of data, but on the other hand, no side effects, right?
I would stick with the cache steps. I actually started with the hidden text box, but I personally try to avoid hidden text box. There's nothing wrong with them. I just found it, actually, I found it easier to get the functionality I wanted on this calculator with the cache steps. Since I was caching multiple values, I guess I could have had multiple hidden text boxes, but I went with the cache route, and I'm pretty confident I would be able to work out the issues and figure out exactly what was happening with those cache steps to get the behavior that I wanted.
Well, the other, actually, something I spied happening recently here. I think you could arbitrarily declare data inputs. In your case, like, a couple of strings, an operator string and another input string. And because those are data names that they're then defined on the form, you could probably use them as a place to stash data. We have never really explored that very much, but I have a hunch that would be potentially another alternative.
Like, you're talking about adding an input to this form.
To the form, yeah.
You know what? I think we could, especially with an active form flow.
Yeah.
Let me see.
So one will stick it in there, the other one will take it out, and
that may be a better way to go. I might do that. Let's see. So now that I just created that operator input to the form, let's see if I could like do a set control value step. Form rules.
well, set control would not be a set control, I fear, by name. Well, can you go after form data?
You could go after form input data, but it's expecting form control data, and this is just a string. Okay. So let's see.
I'll bet you, well, and I think the way we're doing it back in decision 6, where we don't have these steps, is that we would have it be an output and wire the output of the flow to the data name.
Yeah, with a form, with a data flow, I think you would be able to do that. I would count more on these cache steps working, because I'm certain that those are going somewhere. When I'm like outputting a variable from a data flow into like a input that isn't controlled to some control, or isn't tied to some control on the form, I'd be nervous about where that actually is living. And with the set control value step here, it doesn't let you pick the just the input. It has to be a control on the form.
Well, I actually worry more about the cache, in as much as if you're right that it staggers on for the lifetime until the system's restarted. I am suspicious that I already have a system that is struggling for want of memory, but I don't have a good meter to tell me I'm struggling because of memory shortages. And now I have a cache that will have a history of everybody's activity since it started. That's going to be even more memory gobbled up for no value.
So there's a couple of ways to handle that. Like I would think by default it may persist till the end. I actually don't know for sure. I'd have to double check that. But what I would do in that case is, after my form actually closes, there's a clear cache step, I believe, that would allow you to just empty that cache of a particular key or a particular instance type to make sure that that memory isn't just going to get used up. Or you could use a time cache, which will automatically clear after a certain amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of ways to make sure that's being cleaned up, but I would advise, like I said, these steps are typically pretty advanced, and so I would suggest using them only if you know or are confident with making sure you can not have those memory issues you were talking about.
Hey Matt, we had another question. Josh wanted to know how he could add an empty item to a list. I was thinking he could use the add item to list step and then just set that item to null, but I'm not sure like if that makes sense or if there's another way to do that that would make sense for him.
So I think I tried the null and I get a bad pointer error when I try to point to an item that's null on the list. So that might not be the answer. I don't know. Maybe it is. I'm just not doing it right.
What's the use case there?
So yeah, okay. I can take it. Bear with me for a minute. We have a set of drop downs, three drop downs that combined. They can select 1, 2, or 3, and then it goes and it. So okay, so that's fine. If they submit and they do 1, 2, or 3, it's fine. The issue arises when, let's say we want to reopen the form with the data that's been entered already. So now in order to retrieve the proper values for those fields, we need to run a query for each value that was submitted, and then return the right value to fill into the dropdown. We're using a dynamic list step, or we call it whatever gets returned from a query, and then, but the problem is that if they've only selected one item or 2 items, and we're going to fill in all 3, I point to the results of the flow that fills in the drop downs, via index. So it's index 0, 1, or 2. And if there's no 1 or 2, then I thought I could still just use null, right, as was suggested, to just fake it out, but it does not seem to like that. So that's my use case. Sorry it took so long.
No, that's okay. That's tricky. So
Yes.
I'm not totally sure I fully understand the entire use case, but it sounds like there's essentially those selections are going into a dropdown. Like you need an empty item in the dropdown list.
Right. We needed to. Right. So I need to be covered. I need to be covered if they selected 3. So if there's 3, it fills in just fine. And I didn't test this scenario when I was doing my testing. But if there's only, let's say, 2 drop downs selected and the third one is blank, how do I go ahead and tell? When I go and fill in the, you can select what the value should be when you're building a form, right? You can feed it the values in advance. So how would I go ahead and tell it in value, drop down 2 or drop down 3, that they should be blank if the length of the list is only 1 or 2? How do I without it needing that empty one right there to refer to? I guess if I need to put in a ticket, I can do so, or I can experiment on my own. But I thought I'd hop over here and see if there was a quick answer.
It may come to a ticket, but I would love to take a stab at it.
Okay.
You've got a drop down. I'm just going to make it of type string. The data name, string list. Guess I need to add a button to the form. Is your question, I don't think this is it, but is your question essentially like this dropdown would like they may not select anything in this dropdown,
Correct.
and you want that dropdown to have nothing selected.
If that's the, so it's more of a problem if there's, right, if there's, right, so I feed the form the value for the drop down based off of a list. Right, I build a list of the results, right? So okay, so the drop down itself is the result of a query. So to fill it, to populate the drop down, it's a runs a query to fill in the values. That's easy enough to do. But what gets harder is if they come back to that form again for the same, I'm working with patients here, so let's say it's for the same patient. Okay. To come back to that form, the issue is how do we fill in how do we tell the form which value to show? So I save the IDs that correspond to each dropdown, right? The value, that shows the name of the pharmacies, let's say, shows the name of the pharmacy, but stores the ID. And then when it comes back to it, while I'm loading the form, I run some queries off of that ID and then feed that response from that query to get the proper pharmacy from the database. I feed that in. So, but since I have 3 drop downs, right? Option 1, option 2, option 3 for pharmacy, right? I go and run a series of queries on each of the IDs that get sent back. And then I fill in the value of that drop down by pointing to the proper spot on the list. But if there's, so it works fine if they fill in three, but oftentimes they only fill in 1 or 2 pharmacies. So that third one, when it comes to say, oh, give me list item number 2, because it's 0 indexed, list item number 2, it chokes up because like, oh, there's no list item number 2. And I thought I had a contingency that says if there's only 2 items, put a third null item on there. And for some reason, when it points to it, it doesn't like it. Now I didn't try this yet. Now maybe if I do build object, build item, build data, and then just do the other 2 things null, maybe that will work. I don't know. I haven't tried that yet, but
that might work.
Certainly leaving the list item itself as null and adding it to the end of the list doesn't help.
Would it work to just, like, let's say there's only 2 items that are in the list of selectable items for the dropdown? Could you just leave it as 2 items and use some logic to just input null into the selected item? Because when you do that,
I was also thinking that maybe, I don't know how much how easy this is because it's a pretty complicated project. I was also thinking maybe I should just have a logic that it would only add in the number of drop downs that needed based off of how many got filled in. But I don't know if that sounds a little more complicated.
Yeah, it might be worth doing that if that creates like a better user experience.
Right. So
it would add some complication. I think you're right, but you could probably use like a vertical stack and some visibility rules on the form to pull that off.
Yeah.
But if you just have a string list of 1 and 2, and I run this form without passing anything into the selected item, it will just have an empty selection here with the options of 1 and 2. Right. So if you can do some logic before the form, or if you're using data flow or active form flow, maybe you can check to see, okay, does index item 2 exist? If not, use a create data step to pass out an empty or ignore, like essentially just a
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Ignore into that field so that it would just be empty when it's displayed.
So, check. Yeah, let me make a note here. Check.
I think you'll find that to be easier than adding like a null item to a list.
Okay.
I don't know that I've been able to do that successfully without it being kind of finicky.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
No, yeah, thank you. No, that's good. No, I'm glad I even tracked down what the issue was, because it wasn't even
Yeah.
clear to me till now. But now I hopped on to see if there's a quick fix. But it seems like there's gonna be a little bit more effort involved to get it going. That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I hope my ridiculously oversimplified version of this was
No,
helpful.
sometimes simplest is usually the easiest. That's been my experience. So
It's true.
we'll try the simple way and then find harder ways.
Perfect.
Oh, it looks like someone raised their hand. I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce your name. Aishwarya. I asked you to unmute if you'd like to ask your question.
That's the right pronunciation. So be good there.
Glad I got it right.
No, I have a question with respect to the reports. So I have two reports with me. One is a parent report, and then there's a child report. So we are we do have a button in the reports wherein a flow gets initiated, and then we update the values of the reports in the flow. So once that flow is completed, the details are updated in the reports table also, but then we had to manually press on auto refresh to load those details. So I want that to be auto refreshed, if there's any way for that.
I'm not sure about that. Matt, do you happen to know?
So this is about auto refreshing a report on some like action that happens, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know the full use case again here, but there are certainly ways to trigger a report to refresh automatically. And I'm trying to remind myself of exactly what the name of that step is by using this documentation here.
I think, Matt, by the end of the flow, right, we can use the set folder change event so that without using, like, it's my guess, like without using the refresh button every time we add something to the report, the flow will automatically refresh itself.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
thank you. That is the name of the step. Send folder change event.
Yeah, set folder change event.
okay, so I did try that set folder change event. I've added the document ID and then I've tried that. It didn't seem to work, which is why I'm raising this in this forum.
So there could be two reasons why, maybe more, but two that come to mind. Number one, your report has to be set up to be listening for those change events. To do that, it's a setting on the report viewer on a dashboard. So let me show you what that setting is. I'm going to create a page real quick. And I'll put a report viewer on it. I believe it's under behavior.
Oh, I updated this as well.
You did this already, so it's already set to refresh on, I would do on current folder change, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so it's, then the other thing I was thinking it could be is the ID of the folder that you're passing into the send folder change event step. May not be the right one. The quickest way to get the right folder and just to test it out is to look in the URL. So if you navigate to your dashboard, the folder, sorry, in Decisions that has your dashboard and your report on it, you should see in the URL your folder ID of where you currently are. And what you can do is copy that out of the URL and paste it into your send folder change event step. And that way you can be sure you're grabbing the right folder ID for that refresh event.
Okay, so I have a page and it has reports in it, just like how you did here. And I've added that page into a folder, and I'm taking the folder ID of that particular folder. But yeah, I'll check the folder ID there as well. So I'll try that.
And yeah, you haven't tried that yet, or are you saying you've tried that and it did not work?
I've tried that. I've tried taking the folder ID of the page that I've embedded with, and then that is what I've used, but it didn't seem to work.
Interesting. Okay, I might suggest that you use a support ticket to figure out exactly what's going on there. And I know, unfortunately, on these, you're not able to share your screen with me because I'm sure there's some. It's hard to know exactly what might be going on without seeing the full use case there.
Mm-hmm. So I assume that maybe this is the case that because we have a parent-child relationship with the reports, maybe that's causing an issue. That is what I assumed, which is why I had this. I made sure that I told this that we don't have a single report but a dependent report that we are taking and filtering out.
That very well could be the like extra bit of complication to the use case that's causing the issue. But usually the folder ID, wherever your page actually lives, this is the correct folder ID, and it shouldn't matter whether it's a parent report or a child report on that page. If you send the refresh event to this folder, it should still refresh both of those.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't say for sure what's going wrong there.
Okay, so the folder ID is the design folder ID or the folder ID, where we embed the page. So which
It's
folder
where
ID
you,
we can?
yeah, I see what you're saying. So it's where you embed the page. So if I were to add a folder, and I'm going to just add the, I'm going to add that page to this folder. I'm going to pick the one that I just created, which is called page 1.
Mm-hmm.
On here, it will be this folder ID. It'll be the folder ID of page folder. So I could either get folder ID by right-clicking on that folder, or if I look at the URL, this should be the same ID up here as it is in this box.
Okay, so I've exactly done the same steps. I've taken the folder ID here. I've added that listener in the page, and I've added the folder event in one of the flows, and I've added this document ID as well. I mean, folder ID as well.
It sounds like you've done all the steps correctly. And I can't say for sure why, in your case, it's not working without seeing it directly. I think your best bet is to submit a support ticket and either get on a call with a support team member or send them a screenshot of your setup So they can help you debug exactly what is going wrong in your specific case there. Because from what you've described, it sounds like you've hit all the right steps to get it to refresh. I suspect there's something small or one little thing that might be off that's causing it to not quite work.
Okay. Okay, then let me raise a ticket. That's it.
Sorry, I wasn't able to get you any farther than that. But
No,
I
not
do
at all.
trust. I think you'll be able to get there.
Yeah. Thank you. That's all I wanted to know.
Absolutely. Well, we have reached the end of the time. Thank you, everybody. Awesome questions today. We will see you all next time, next week. Monday, we will not have a lunch and learn because of the holiday, but we will resume on Tuesday.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Steph.
No problem. Thank you.
Thanks.